so much for the warm introduction, Adam. So today we will be discussing don't just believe, know, the significance of the certificate of analysis. I'm going to go ahead and start off this panel with everyone's introductions, and I'll let everyone introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Jake Black. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Treehouse Biotech. We do hemp manufacturing and wholesale ingredient manufacture, and then we also have a R&D team focused on the isolation and conversion of a lot of the minor cannabinoids. And so I have a PhD in chemistry, so I'm bringing a kind of chemical background to this conversation, hopefully.
Alex Leznov, President and CFO of Advanced Extraction LLC in Brighton, Colorado. We are a vertically integrated hemp company with a grow division, lab division, extraction processing division, contract manufacturing, and our retail brand, Pure Hemp Botanicals.
My name is Wesley McGuire. I'm the technical manager for Pixis Labs and Columbia Food Labs located in Portland, Oregon. We're a full-service analytical laboratory that serves the environmental and agricultural industries over a variety of different commodities. I have over a decade of experience doing analytical testing for the agricultural sector, and my background is primarily in residue analysis and phytochemicals.
Hi there, I'm Heidi Ernest. I am an attorney in private practice, and I'm based here in Seattle. I represent only cannabis clients, so come and see me, and let's talk about your issues after the panel.
Very good. Thank you so much. So when we buy a product for the first time, our natural instinct is to make sure we pay for what's inside. A certificate of analysis is the cannabis industry's way of showing that when a customer buys one of our products, they're getting exactly what they paid for. They are a notarized form of our industry, and making sure we have them available for each of our products is how we grow our business and thrive. In this time when the cannabis market is ripe for expansion, especially after Farm Bill 2018, we must collectively ensure that nothing jeopardizes our reputation or the industry's reputation. So the certificate of analysis, also known as C of A's or COAs, can be provided by third-party laboratories or in-house laboratories. What qualities should business owners, brand owners, and stakeholders consider when considering a third-party lab?
Yeah, so I think what should be done is kind of what is done in all other industries, and that testing needs to go through ISO accredited labs. So ISO 17025 is the specific analytical testing kind of code, internationally recognized, and that, proves that the lab is following good practices for testing, data integrity, all of those things. And given that it exists and has existed for a long time for all other industries, it makes a lot of sense to hold ourselves to that same standard. So there's a lot of labs out there doing testing that aren't ISO accredited, and they could be doing a fantastic job, for sure. But that seal of approval is kind of what then the consumer can rest on as well, that ISO, just like any other product they're consuming, it has been tested to the same standard.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that a little bit. For those of you who don't know ISO, it's the International Standards Organization, and they do have an accreditation for analytical laboratories. As Alex and I discussed on our panel yesterday, knowing the accreditation of your laboratory is only the first step. While I absolutely support what Jake is saying, in that you should look for a laboratory that has that accreditation, particularly my lab is the only ISO accredited cannabis lab in Oregon, so I'm a big fan of that. But that's only the beginning. You need to vet your laboratory. You need to take the time to audit them, to build a relationship, to understand what they do, visit their facility, know that they know what your needs are, and allow them to help direct your testing programs and design it to fit your needs. Right now, the regulatory environment around hemp is pretty scant. And so you can really rely on the expertise of your laboratory chemists who have knowledge from doing analytical testing on many other crops and commodities over time to help design a program that's going to ensure that your product is healthy and safe.
Yeah, I think what Wes is saying is very important. The certification is definitely key, but there's other factors that we're going to be talking about throughout the panel. One of those is the certificate of analysis itself. What does it look like? What is it that you want to have that certificate of analysis look like? Every lab has a different style, different format, so understanding the readability of that, does that readability match with what you want to be displaying to your consumer or as a consumer? And as Wes said, the communication with a lab, because there are going to be challenges. You could select a lab and say, yeah, this is our guys, but it's better to have a couple labs that you feel comfortable working with, that you can compare results between, and that if you have a challenge that as Wes said, you can contact someone at that lab, you can speak with them, and you can understand if possibly that test needs to be run, if there was some type of problem, that they can go back and validate the test run specific to that individual test that you want to inquire about.
So can any of you talk about laboratories that will market themselves as 17025, but they may only have 17025 accreditation for, say, water activity, and yet they'll just market themselves very blanketly as being a 17025 accredited laboratory?
Yeah, I think this is the type of thing that we see happen across multiple industries with multiple different things. There's a similar thing going on with GMP right now. There's a similar thing going on with organic. Just because you're certified for one point of a process or one piece of equipment doesn't give you a blanket certification. So those types of things exist, I think, within maybe a little bit more rampant within our industry, as it's a young growing industry, but I think it exists really across the board. And again, it gets back to either the consumer's education and familiarity with that, or as producers, as part of the chain of supply, that we make sure we're properly vetting our suppliers and vendors.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. What a lot of people don't understand about the ISO 17025 accreditation process is that it is specific to methodology. So a laboratory will be accredited for a specific method or a specific technique. And then some laboratories will like to take that stamp of accreditation and just put it right there on their report, so it looks like everything is accredited. There is a way that you can check that, and it's very simple. Just ask to see your laboratory's scope of accreditation. The accreditation body that issues that certification issues it with a scope, and that scope lists all of the methods that the laboratory is accredited for, and you'll know immediately whether the methods that are being used to test your product and all of the criteria listed on your C of A are accredited or not accredited. Now, if the laboratory is ethical, they should specify which methods are accredited and which are not. But as Alex said, it's a brand new industry, and there are a lot of laboratories that are very new and just trying to get their piece of the market, and they're going to do what they can to pump themselves up and look credible. And I'm certainly not going to try to discredit any other laboratories. Accreditation and certification is a process, not an end goal. Every lab is always in the process of trying to constantly improve. But you can find out for yourself what is accredited and what is not by asking for your laboratory's scope.
Excellent. And what would you say for consumers and or stakeholders who don't necessarily understand the scope of ISO 17025? That's more being able to trace back all of your work, being able to document everything, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee accuracy of results. So I'm very specifically talking about reference standards that may be subpar. How many of you in the audience have seen C of A's where your isolate is 105%? Anybody in the audience? Yeah? Would anybody like to address that?
Well, and I approach that from, I think the reference standard is an interesting thing, and then you do get into kind of the inherent error in testing. So you could have 105, maybe pushing it, but 102, 103, and be within like the realm of scientific validity. Like there is no such thing as more than 100%, absolutely. But in every step of a scientific measurement, there is uncertainty in that. So if you have a reference, that reference itself is already within a range of purity that the lab that you buy it from is at. Then when you measure it out, you pour, it works with anything. You pour a milliliter or 10 milliliters of whatever water into your glass. That's not 10.000000 milliliters. That's 10 plus or minus 1 milliliter. And so every step in the measurement, and when you're doing this sort of testing, you're going through 5, 6, 10 different measurement steps, and introduces air, and all of that air compounds. And so you can, I think, you can see those errors, but yeah, understanding that a method has at least been validated and that the standards are coming from themselves ISO accredited labs or, reliable suppliers who have been doing this for a long time. I think that's very important.
So, Twee, your question kind of has two parts to me. One is about reference standards, and really briefly, I would like to say that the validity of reference standards is every bit as tricky as the validity of your own C of A. When a laboratory orders a reference standard, we order it from also, a supplier that's also accredited, and that does not mean that it is perfect. We get a C of A with it. It is still the responsibility of the laboratory to determine whether or not that C of A is accurate. And I've had many cases, particularly because we order hundreds and hundreds of reference standards from different sources, many cases where the supplier is accredited, it comes with a certificate of analysis, and it turns out to not be the thing that it is claimed to be, or it is not the purity that's claimed, and that's the laboratory's job to determine. And as the client of that laboratory, it's your job to make sure that the laboratory is aware of and doing the proper underlying research documentation and traceability to ensure that. Not every laboratory does, and not every laboratory has the time, but that's important. The second part of that is about uncertainty of measurement, and I will say that most of the methodology that's used to measure the concentration of, say, cannabinoids in a high purity isolate is really not sufficient for measuring isolates that are over 95% pure. Comparison to a reference standard is really not the ideal way to do that, and you should ask your laboratory about mass balance purity analysis, where the purity is determined through identifying and characterizing the impurities rather than simply trying to measure the main component, because when you are dealing with something that's 95, 98, 99% pure, those errors get multiplied, and the errors are unavoidable. That's just a statistical certainty of calculation. You're going to have error, and when you're dealing with something very, very high purity, those errors are magnified. So taking an entirely different analytical approach is necessary. Not all labs offer that kind of purity analysis, but some do. So I would definitely ask about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Wes. And I know one of the things that we do within our lab is we'll actually also have different methodologies for different samples so that you have a different dilution rate. Because as Wes said, when you're looking at an isolate product that's going to be 95+%, identifying between 98, 99, and 100 is really, really challenging if you're only looking at the concentration. So I really like that idea of looking at the impurities, which is not something I've heard before. So that was a great point. But in addition to that, then if you're talking about the exact opposite, where you're trying to find 0.3% or less THC in a product, or what we're doing right now in the industry, working towards THC free. Okay, how far out zeros are you going to be able to evidence you're THC free? What is your lab's minimum level of quantification and detection, and making sure that the COA indicates what those levels are and how those are reported are key. And one of the ways that a lab can get more accurate as they have lower levels of a compound present is to reduce the amount of dilution that they're sampling that particular sample at.
Real quick to piggyback off that, because we run into very similar issues where if a lab, they could have, again, we talked about it, a method that maybe is ISO validated, great, but then if you're looking at 95% but also wanting to look at 0.1, 0.3%, there'll also be labs now that will ask you what you're looking for, which I think, whether it's like legal or not is another thing, but from an ethical testing standpoint, our stance is we're paying you money, you're supposed to be accredited in a good lab. We should not have to tell you to look at the 0.3 range and also look at the 95 range. You should be doing your due diligence and testing at high concentrations and low concentrations and doing the extra dilutions and doing the extra work. And sure, yeah, you're not going to make as much money and be able to do as many samples, but that's what is required given that there's so many different cannabinoids in a lot of the products and at varying levels from 99 to 0.1. And there's a lot of legal ramifications around specific cannabinoids. So,
Thank you for bringing that up. And what sort of legal ramifications, Heidi, should an operator consider when they are lab shopping? Because, the C of A is what's going to market your property or your product. You want to ensure that it has the highest concentration or, it's exactly what you state it is. So what sort of legal ramifications are there when you send your product out to 3 or 4 different laboratories and you kind of shop that C of A?
Yeah, the C of A is important from a legal perspective in kind of 2 different ways. And one is that it can be, it's permissive of your activities, right? So if you've got a solid C of A and you've got a solid lab, you are able to go ahead and take advantage of all of the hemp regulations that are available to you. You are able to transport that across state lines. And we've actually seen already this year, there was a case that was before a federal court of appeals where there was a transportation issue going from West Virginia to Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly. And in West Virginia, they had that transport stopped, seized, and tested they wanted to retest it. It had already been tested so thoroughly by a state-accredited lab that when it got to the level of the court said they are complying with the law, this is a solid laboratory, and you have to give them back their product and allow them to ship it. If that C of A had been faulty, if that lab had been faulty in any way, there would have been a completely different result for that company. So in that way, a solid C of A is permissive for your company. It's also detrimental to your company. If you get any sort of, result that is outside of the permissive ranges, depending on what state you're in, here in Washington, you have to stop what you're doing. You have to go through certain remediation activities. You can't move that sample back to your facility unless you quarantine it, label it, take all these extra steps. So in some ways, a faulty C of A will subject you to additional liability. So it's so very important that that C of A and the lab itself are reputable so that you can use that as a shield for your business. Should you get a violation from the WSLCB here in Washington, or should you get a civil liability kind of issue? If you're getting a products liability suit, if you have a design defect and something damages somebody as they're using your product, if your C of A is meeting those minimum standards that the state requires, that's called industry standard. And it's not dispositive in your case, but it will certainly help you avoid all liability. And one of the most important things for me is that these regulations are constantly changing. So when you have those C of A's for past products and you have good data keeping records and everything like that, should we learn something new, which we will learn over the next several years with all the research that's being done, and as these standards change, should anyone look at you retroactively for liability for things that you were doing in the past that doesn't meet the current standards? It's almost like installing glass 20 years ago versus installing glass in your building now. You have to have different fire standards and different fire ratings now. But if you fully complied with the industry standard back 20 years ago, you are fully compliant in the law for all of that activity. So it's really important for forward-looking and past-looking activity in both a permissive and a detrimental way with respect to your legal dealings that you have a solid C of A and a solid lab. And I think Wes was talking to this earlier. I think the best way to do that is to truly develop a relationship with your lab or multiple labs, as these guys are talking about in far more sophisticated terms than I am. The reliability is absolutely key. And if you're in this industry, you know it doesn't exist. So that's what we're really working for on the, legislative and policy level. But for the time being, it is absolutely critical that you make those compliance issues. You check that box and you're able to run your business. Otherwise, you're going to end up in some very murky waters.
And it's an interesting comment you made about the a company establishing itself as compliant through its historical testing and all of that work, and then also the comment you made about, labs asking a customer if they're looking for something particular, which is also not something that I would consider quite kosher, but at the same time, based upon the comments that you're discussing about, you could understand why a producer might want to limit their liability of their risk in a COA that they might get from a laboratory. And I think it's a very unique thing that the cannabis industry is going through right now that doesn't really exist anywhere else with any other product. We're not seeing this type of scrutiny and regulation on other products in the marketplace. So really the cannabis industry, and particularly hemp CBD right now, is being asked to take on a burden that is very unique and does not exist otherwise in the marketplace.
That's very true. Speaking of cannabis specifically, the state regulations that surround cannabis and places where it has been legalized is a new frontier for testing regulations in the U.S. The U.S. In general does not require compliance testing on commodities. They do have tolerances and limits for certain chemicals, but the testing's not required. The liability is on whoever in the chain is in possession of the commodity when it's tested. That's different than the way a lot of other countries handle it, particularly Japan, EU, Korea, where testing is required. This is new in the U.S., and so cannabis is really bearing a serious burden.
Yeah.
Now, hemp, they haven't figured out how to regulate yet. It's not regulated the same state to state, and there is no guideline for how it will be regulated federally. So we have to see how that's going to develop. But your laboratory, we hope, should be familiar enough with the regulations that apply to you to help design your testing program accordingly. Not only for what the current regulations are, but for how the regulations are likely to develop. As we have been working within those regulatory environments on other crops for a long time.
And I just wanted to throw this out too, kind of going to that point of no other industry is held to that standard. Like, you go to Whole Foods and buy a tincture or a vitamin, do you ask to see the C of A of your fish oil? Do you ask to see the heavy metals in it? Do you ask to see the residual solvents in it? Do you ask to see the kind of microbial testing on it? So every product we produce and that is commonly produced, the good consumers are asking for that in the tinctures that are being sold right underneath us right now. Like, what's your COA? What's your residual solvent? What's the processing method? So it's being held to a completely different consumer standard as well because there is no regulation. But from the other side of things, like, all those other products in Whole Foods are regulated by the FDA, so you trust that that's happening. But from my standpoint, I've lost a lot of faith in any product I'm buying in the grocery store at all. So.
Yeah, and just briefly on that, something that I find absolutely fascinating in the testing realm, and very much to the point that we are privately bearing this burden ourselves. When you go get fish oil, you have a nutritional label on there, right? But when it comes to the C of A, well, California is an exception, but here in Washington, there is no regulation for the format. So we've got some clients coming up with some really cool proprietary ways to display this information that isn't just a list of chemicals. They're diagrams and color tables and things like that that are really making them accessible to clients. So your C of A is important for your business, of course, but then when it comes to your clients too, if you go ahead and just put that information out there, or you have it available on your website and you have it in a cool and interesting way, that's a cool way to drive your brand and also to influence the FDA as they put out these regulations. If you have a cool idea like that, if you have any sort of insights or things that you're worried about, there is an open comment period with the FDA right now until they just extended it 2 extra weeks until July 16th. So go ahead and sign online. You can check out my Instagram. I have all the links there. Just go click it, send a quick little note over there, and let your voice be heard. Because we are really bearing this burden of developing these standards, but it's also very cool because we have a lot of freedom and creativity and opportunity here. So if anyone's even a testing lab and you're looking for other sorts of like business diversifications, we're seeing a lot of R&D around these labels. And it's a really cool opportunity, even though it is a large burden for us.
So I'm going to take it a different direction. Jake, you brought up different types of testing, and what should stakeholders be looking for very specifically for the different types of tests that they should request from, say, an ingredient supplier for the different types of matrices or products out there?
Yeah, so what we commonly see and kind of practice for all of our products is incoming material. So we deal with hemp, has to be tested for pesticides, heavy metals, and potency. And pesticides because you can use pesticides, but consumers don't want pesticides in their food, and so you want to see that the hemp that you're getting has not been used with pesticides. Heavy metals, because hemp is known for leaching heavy metals out of soil, and those, cadmium, lead, arsenic are not good for you, obviously, and so you want to test for that. And then as well as the potency to make sure it's hemp. It's a legally under the 0.3% limit. And then on products going out, we have kind of a tracking of this is the hemp batch that came in and this is the product that it belongs to, so you can see that the hemp came in good and now the product going out is good, which includes potency again to show that you're THC compliant or THC free depending on the product, or whatever that means, but as well as what other cannabinoids are in there, because people will pay more for other cannabinoids like CBG and CBC to be there. Then there's residual solvents is common because there's a lot of solvent processing in frankly a lot of food products, and nobody asks about the solvents in their vegetable oil, but that's how a lot of products are made, with solvent processing. So again, the burden in this industry is higher because people hear the word chemical and freak out. But anyways, so solvents to make sure it's loaded with a bunch of solvents, and then terpenes is another one that people are interested in, but that one is kind of, I guess, niche depending on the customer. So those are the broad swath.
Jake, I think you covered a lot of the things that I would otherwise say, but I do want to note that in the U.S. there are no pesticides which are labeled by the EPA for use on hemp. That may change as hemp is becoming a much more important crop. However, there are absolutely no pesticide residues that are legally tolerated on hemp. Which means that any pesticide residue that is found either on the hemp or on a product made from the hemp could be a violation. So pesticide residue testing is important, but if we are following the model of cannabis state to state, the testing lists are extremely different. So what I would recommend, and what I think a lot of manufacturers and producers in the hemp industry are starting to clue into, is that we need to be treating this more like another food or agricultural commodity and testing for the broadest list possible, not just the list of 13 or 59 or 64 from your particular state, but test it the same way that we would test a food product or an organic crop, and test for an extremely broad range of pesticides. Laboratories are equipped with instrumentation now that allows them to test for hundreds of pesticides in a single screen, and you shouldn't settle for less if you want the knowledge that your product is safe. Now, when we talk about certificate of analysis, often we're only talking about characterization of the main components, but Jake brought up a lot of the other things that are very important on this commodity. Heavy metals is important because hemp is a known bioremediator that draws up heavy metals from the soil. Pesticides is important, not just because someone could be using pesticides off-label, but because of where hemp crops are grown. Often the agricultural land will be contaminated from past use, and they will uptake those pesticides from the environment. One thing that I don't hear enough people talking about is mycotoxins. There are harvesting and storage considerations for hemp specifically that can allow for growth of funguses, and those funguses can leave behind toxic chemical residues that can render your product extremely toxic to human or animal health. So not just the common aspergillus toxins, but fusarium toxins are very common on hemp and cannabis, and there are laboratories that can test for these things. So those are something that should be on our radar.
Yeah, I was also going to indicate micro is very important, and then I think for the end product also, one of the biggest things that's going to come about is going to be stability testing as these products are being created. Because if we're either the consumer, we want to make sure the product is stable for a long period of time. If we're a producer looking to sell into retail, these retailers are going to want to know they can put that product on their shelves and that they're still going to have a year plus shelf life on their shelves, ideally closer to 2 years. And if you're talking about a product being able to get through the distribution system, particularly in a big box retail environment, it may take 6 months to 12 months from the time that product is produced before it even first hits a shelf. So you're talking about really getting up to 3-year stability levels on most finished products would be what most retailers are going to be looking for. And I think the brands that can establish that with real certification, preferably real-time stability studies, are going to have products that the mass market can most latch on to.
It's worth noting, to piggyback on your point, Alex, that most laboratories that are prepared to do analysis for cannabis are not set up to do nutrition testing, shelf life testing, and that kind of stuff. Some are. Pyxis does offer full analytical services, but most cannabis labs are new and are working off of what is currently regulated. So talk to your laboratory, see what they can offer you, and look for laboratories that have been doing food analysis because they are already set up with those kinds of methods and can help you with the process development for your product and make sure that it's going to fit the needs of the retailer and of the consumer, as well as fit the regulations that we know are going to be incoming.
And so with so many new CBD products out there, you can buy it online, you could buy it, at the gas station, you can buy it from your neighbor. I don't know. There are places where I have seen CBD and I'm like, I don't think that came from an approved source. What can consumers do to ensure the quality of their product and that they're not just buying snake oil?
Again, you can talk more about the regulations, but there's, I guess, not, and it's questionable if it, right now, CBD is not supposed to be in food or nutraceuticals at all in the entire country. So first off, that's why there's no regulations, and that's what the whole hearing panel is about, and I'm not a lawyer, so I won't go into that. But I think it's on the consumer, which is a big burden for the consumer, to say if it's a specific tincture or whatever, that company that you're buying it from should have a COA of that batch of products, and it should link to the batch number there. And if they say no, then I would be, okay, I'm not buying it, because you truly do not know what's in it. And if they're going to be selling a product, I think it's reasonable to put the onus on them to pay for a certificate of analysis and show it to the consumer for at least, the batch of products. Obviously, you don't test every individual bottle. And then if they're not making all of the products themselves, they should be willing to maybe show you their supplier's COA showing that the ingredients that went in were good as far as CBD and cannabinoids go. So again, it's a big burden for the consumer to bear right now, but until there's a regulation that's cracking down on people, it's kind of necessary.
It is a big burden to bear, but I don't think it's an unreasonable burden. And the responsibility of the consumer in that scenario is not any different than the responsibility of you as the producer or manufacturer who needs to vet your laboratory, or of the laboratory who needs to vet suppliers of their reference standards. If you're a consumer and you want to know that you're buying a product that you can trust, vet the producer. Do exactly as Jake is suggesting and ask for the certificate of analysis, inquire, and transparency is key. If this is a product that you're going to be using frequently over time, people are using hemp-derived cannabinoids as medicine to treat chronic conditions, and you need to know that that is safe. Even if you're buying treats that you're going to feed to your dog, you want to know that it's safe. So take a little bit of extra time. This isn't a one-off instance where you're just buying a product and using it and walking away. You are developing a relationship with this product, and you should not be afraid to reach out to the producer or to the supplier and develop a relationship there.
Yeah, I think some basic, vetting, again, having batch numbers, being able to have those tied to a website are all good. It's very hard to as the consumer, most consumers aren't going to have the knowledge, even possibly to read the COA or really track through this. And again, it's an unusual burden that's being asked of the consumer that doesn't exist in other places. And fortunately, we live in a very technologically advanced and social world at this point in time. So I think those producers that aren't making good product get found out fairly quickly. Their products get posted about that they're not real. Fortunately, CBD does have, I think, a very real impact on the body that is noticeable, regardless of whether it can achieve some of the things that certain people would like to say it does. It's certainly a noticeable impact. So if you're taking a CBD product and you're feeling zero impact from it, it may be that you do not have a good product. And again, getting online, evaluating the products that are available to you, what the reviews are about that product, is a good initial way in addition to what you may be looking for in a certificate of analysis.
And just briefly, not to always be the dream crusher here, but there was a case that just came out of California with a lab. You might have heard about this. And there was a CFO or something, someone who had absolutely no business touching the results of the testing lab itself. But there was a piece of faulty machinery with respect to the pesticide testing, I believe. So he just made up numbers for a couple of months and put them on the COA and sent them out to their clients. And the clients had no idea. So once this was discovered, in steps, the state government at this point, and they didn't even have to pull their license. They volunteered to give up their license while they figured out what internal processes went wrong. And then, the government steps up and says, well, let's recall these products. They had already been sold. So at this point, literally nothing happened, other than this company said, we'll look at what we did wrong and we'll see how we can fix it. I mean, that puts a lot of risk on businesses and consumers. So I think your relationship with your lab is absolutely important for the health of your business. And as a consumer, it's absolutely important for your personal health.
Yeah. And I had just one thing to add real quick. It's not really related, but it came up earlier, and I've been thinking about it more and more, especially when you're getting different products with different effects. And the law says that you can have less than 0.3% THC in a product, and it can be hemp-derived and legal, in that sense. But 0.3% of THC in a milliliter of a tincture is roughly, I think, like 6 milligrams, which that like, for if you're not a constant marijuana user, that can get you high. And if you take double the dose, 2 little droppers of this oil that is sold to you as a hemp product, that's 12 milligrams of THC. That's more than a lot of edibles. So like, you can then get high using products. So that's a whole other issue, which I didn't want to like open a can of worms, but I think that just brought it to what the consumer, because if a consumer doesn't want to get high and they get high, that is a bad thing. And that's a big concern within the industry as well, because it's below the legal limit. But when it's 0.3% of such a large volume, you can get a lot of THC still.
And is there any recourse for consumers? So let's just say very specifically, everyone likes to promote their product as THC-free. And I think we all know and agree that there's no such thing as 100% anything, right? And so for C of A's that either they only report the second dilution and they don't report the results from the first dilution, namely any sort of rare cannabinoids that are at lower potencies, is there any recourse for a consumer if they're taking a THC-free product and they test positive for THC?
So I was just going to comment really fast on the 0.3 in a milliliter. So it would basically be just under 3 milligrams, which would be allowed in that milliliter. But additionally, as you indicated, what kind of drug test is a person taking that might have them result positive, and how much of a product are they consuming, and how often are they consuming it? The product could be completely legal under the hemp bill below 0.3, but if you go ahead and you take 10 doses of it and you just took in 30 milligrams of THC, you're probably going to test positive on any type of test out there. I don't know if anyone else has any comment. I've heard basically the equivalent of 0.6 milligrams of THC on a weekly basis, or total of more than 2 milligrams in a 24-hour period would result in a positive test on the standard urine analysis that most employers, I can't remember the name of that test, maybe somebody else knows, but those are the numbers that I've heard thrown out there.
Yeah, I mean, you can get fired for THC, even if you have a medical card. I don't mean to bring up all these tragic cases, but there was a guy who was working in a call center, and he was a paraplegic, and he used medical cannabis only off premises, only after hours, and they still canned him and took away all of his benefits over this medically authorized use. So if you're not medically authorized and you have THC in your system and your private employer says no, that's you're going to get fired.
So we only have about 5 minutes left for this panel discussion, and I wanted to open up the floor for any questions that anyone might have in the audience. Yes, sir. Oh, I think she's bringing the mic to you.
Hola. Hello. All right. So one of my takeaways here from this panel is get to know your labs and have a relationship, and I get that. And that's more geared towards producers, manufacturers. I'm a retailer. I run 2 virtual dispensaries in California, and we're medically focused. We post labs on our product pages and all that, and we require those to the manufacturers. But really, in California, it comes from the distributors. The distributors of these products are tasked with doing the labs. And I don't know, if I have an issue with the labs, it's not like knowing my lab and calling them. It's a different ball of wax here. So I was wondering, and maybe there's no answer to this, and again, this is more on the THC side, but what's somebody like me to do if I see some lab results and they look like fishy or something? And if
So that is a very tricky question, and trust is difficult when there are so many links in the chain. I personally don't trust anybody in this industry. I don't even trust my own lab. One of my jobs in the laboratory is to do investigations. If we have a result that is questioned, it's my job to go through and investigate, talk to every person, technician or analyst involved in the chain, inspect the data for quality controls, see if I can figure out what went wrong. And that's just good science. So that goes double for me when dealing with anyone else in another part of the industry. And I think you're asking a really relevant question, and unfortunately there's not a great answer. But the best thing that I can suggest is get third-party testing. If you suspect that there is something amiss with a certificate of analysis, have it checked by another laboratory. Or contact the laboratory that issued it and do your best to ask them about it and see if they can help resolve the discrepancies. If this is an accredited laboratory, they are required to respond to a customer inquiry with an investigation. If you ask them, is there something wrong with this report, they must investigate it and inform you of the results. That's a part of the quality system that these labs are required to uphold. So those are 2 ways that you can approach that, either by finding another laboratory to check the validity of the results or asking the laboratory to investigate itself.
Yeah, and kind of we've talked about it a lot though too, is like, so you were buying a product and there's a third-party COA and it says X, whatever, it's good, and then you're questioning. So now, like,